The clock on the station wall struck midnight, its chime ringing out in the quiet, empty platform. A cold breeze swept through, making Daniel pull his jacket tighter around himself as he stepped forward. The last train of the night rumbled into the station, its metal body groaning as it came to a halt. The doors slid open with a slow, almost hesitant hiss, as if reluctant to let anyone inside. Daniel paused for a moment, glancing up and down the empty platform. There were no other passengers, no station attendants, just him and the silent train waiting before him. Something about it felt wrong, but it was late. He had no other way home. Shaking off his unease, he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights above flickering sporadically, casting long, wavering shadows along the rows of empty seats. The air inside was stale, thick with a strange metallic scent. As Daniel moved forward, his footsteps echoed in the unnatural stillness. There was only one other person in the carriage. A man sat at the far end, hunched forward in his seat. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, the hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge Daniel's presence. Daniel chose a seat near the middle of the carriage and dropped into it with a sigh. He pulled out his phone, glancing at the screen. No signal. Typical. The train jolted forward. The familiar rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks filled the air, but the silence between the sounds felt heavier than usual. Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing back toward the other passenger. The man hadn't moved an inch. He remained perfectly still, his posture rigid, his head tilted downward just enough that his face was hidden in shadow. Something about it sent a prickle of unease crawling up Daniel's spine. He turned back toward the window, watching as the city lights blurred past. Maybe the man was just asleep, or lost in thought. There were plenty of normal explanations for his behavior. Then the lights flickered, just for a second. A brief, stuttering blink of darkness. And when they came back, the man was staring at him. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. The man's head had barely moved, still tilted downward, but his eyes, wide, unblinking, were locked directly onto Daniel. The whites of his eyes seemed too large, his pupils shrunken down to small pinpricks. They were unnatural, wrong. Daniel quickly looked away, his heart hammering in his chest. He swallowed, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the flickering lights had played tricks on his eyes. The lights flickered again, and this time, the man was gone. Daniel's breath came out in short, shallow gasps. His eyes darted around the carriage. The seats were empty. There was nowhere for the man to have gone. The doors hadn't opened. His pulse pounded in his ears. Slowly, hesitantly, he stood up. He turned, peering toward the back of the train, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. He turned back toward the front and nearly screamed. The man was right there, standing just a few feet away, close enough that Daniel could see the way his mouth was slightly parted, his lips dark and cracked, close enough that he could see the unnatural paleness of his skin, the hollowed-out shadows under his eyes. Daniel stumbled backward, his legs colliding with the seat behind him. His breath hitched as the man took a slow step forward. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, a whisper brushed against Daniel's ear. "You shouldn't have boarded." The words were cold, hollow, wrong. Daniel spun around, his hands fumbling for the emergency stop button. He slammed his fist against it once, twice. Nothing happened. The train didn't slow. If anything, it was speeding up. He turned back toward the man, but the carriage was empty again. His own reflection stared back at him from the window, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He exhaled shakily, watching as his breath fogged the glass. And then, his reflection smiled. Daniel's real face remained frozen in terror, but the reflection grinned, a wide, stretching grin, too large, too sharp. The lights flickered one last time, and the train plunged into darkness. Anna stepped onto the night train, relieved to find an empty seat near the window. The station outside was dimly lit, the few remaining lights casting long, wavering shadows on the platform. It had been a long day, and all she wanted was to get home. As she settled in, she took a quick glance around. The carriage was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. An old man sat a few rows ahead, his hands folded neatly in his lap. A woman in a gray dress sat across the aisle, staring out the window. Near the door, a man in a dark suit sat with his head slightly tilted down. None of them moved. Anna shifted in her seat, brushing off the unease creeping up her spine. It was late. People were probably just tired, lost in their thoughts. The train jerked forward. The familiar hum of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks filled the silence. She turned to her phone, but as expected, no signal. As the train moved through the dark countryside, Anna couldn't shake the strange atmosphere in the carriage. The passengers weren't just quiet. They were unnaturally still. No one adjusted their seat. No one checked their phone. No one even blinked. A cold sensation crawled up her arms. Her gaze drifted to the man near the door. His posture was rigid, his hands resting on his lap, fingers perfectly aligned. He hadn't moved since she boarded. Neither had the woman across from him. Neither had the old man. Anna's chest tightened. She turned to the window, willing herself to focus on the darkness outside. But as she glanced at her reflection in the glass, she noticed something that sent ice through her veins. The passengers were staring at her. Her heart stilled. She turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. But they were exactly as they had been before, sitting, motionless, staring straight ahead. Her hands tightened around her bag. "I'm just tired," she told herself. "It's late. My mind is playing tricks on me." The train rumbled on, stopping briefly at the next station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform. No one got on. No one got off. The doors closed. The train continued. Anna's grip on her bag tightened. Minutes passed. She forced herself to look straight ahead, determined not to glance at her reflection again. But the eerie silence pressed down on her, making her skin crawl. Then, a sound, soft, subtle, a whisper. "You're one of us now." Anna's blood ran cold. Her head snapped to the side, and she gasped. The old man, the woman, the man in the suit, they were all facing her now, their wide, unblinking eyes locked onto hers. The lights flickered. For a split second, their faces seemed distorted, twisted into something hollow, something inhuman. Then the lights steadied, and they were as they had been before, still, unmoving. The train kept going. The next station arrived. The doors slid open. Anna tried to move, to stand, to run, but she couldn't. Her hands remained neatly folded in her lap. Her gaze fixed straight ahead, unmoving, unblinking. The train continued. Jason rushed onto the platform just as the final train of the night pulled in, brakes screeching against the tracks. He exhaled sharply, adjusting his backpack. He had nearly missed it. The doors slid open with a slow, mechanical hiss. The platform was nearly deserted, and from the looks of it, so was the train. Only a few passengers sat scattered throughout the dimly lit carriage. Jason stepped inside. The air was stale, tinged with the metallic scent of old steel, and something faintly musty, like damp fabric left out too long. He found a seat near the middle, dropping into it with a relieved sigh. The train lurched forward. Outside, the city lights blurred as the train moved into the dark countryside. Jason pulled out his phone, checking for messages. No signal. Of course, he glanced up. A few rows ahead, a girl sat alone, her long dark hair partially obscuring her face as she stared out the window. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, just sat there completely still. Further down, an elderly man slumped slightly in his seat, his chin resting against his chest as if he had dozed off. Another passenger, a man in a black coat, sat at the far end, facing forward. He too was completely motionless. Jason frowned. Something about the stillness in the carriage unnerved him. He shook his head, brushing off the feeling. It's just a late train. People are tired. Minutes passed. The train rattled on, rocking slightly with each turn. Jason leaned back, closing his eyes. A faint whisper of sound, barely audible, made his eyes snap open. He turned his head slightly, scanning the carriage. Nothing had changed. The girl still faced the window. The old man remained in his slumped posture. The man in black sat perfectly still. The whisper came again. This time, Jason was sure he had heard it. A quiet, breathy murmur. He couldn't make out the words. His hands tightened around his backpack. Maybe someone's talking in their sleep, he reasoned. The train rumbled forward. Another station passed. The doors slid open. No one got on. No one got off. The train continued. Jason's stomach twisted. He turned toward the girl by the window. She wasn't there. His breath caught in his throat. The seat was empty. But that wasn't possible. He hadn't heard her move, hadn't seen her leave. Jason sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. He turned toward the old man. The seat was empty. His heart pounded. A chill crawled up his spine. Slowly, his gaze drifted toward the man in black. He was still there, still unmoving, still facing forward. Jason swallowed, his throat dry. Something was wrong. The lights flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the man in black turned his head toward Jason. The lights returned. Jason's breath seized. The man was staring directly at him. His face was expressionless, his eyes empty. No pupils, no irises, just vast white voids. Jason bolted upright, gripping the seat in front of him. The train screeched as it took a turn, the wheels groaning against the tracks. Jason's hands shook. The lights flickered again. For a brief moment, everything was swallowed in darkness. Then, a whisper right behind his ear. "You were never meant to leave." The lights snapped back on. The train was empty. Every seat, every row, empty. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps. His hands trembled as he turned toward the window. His reflection stared back at him. Then, it blinked. Jason didn't. The reflection smiled. The train rattled on, disappearing into the endless night. The legend had been around for decades. A train that ran only at night. A train that never stopped at any station. And a train that carried souls who could never leave. Most dismissed it as an urban myth, just another ghost story meant to scare children. But Ethan, Brian, and Lisa weren't children. They were thrill seekers, armed with flashlights and cameras. They made their way to an abandoned train station on the outskirts of town. It had been decommissioned years ago, yet the tracks remained, stretching into the darkness. "This is ridiculous," Lisa muttered, rubbing her arms against the night chill. "We've been out here for hours." Ethan grinned. "Just wait. If the stories are true, the train only appears past midnight." Brian checked his watch. 12:03 a.m. He let out a frustrated sigh. And then, a distant rumble. Lisa froze. "Do you hear that?" The tracks trembled beneath their feet. A low, mournful whistle echoed through the night. Brian's eyes widened. "No way!" A train emerged from the darkness. It looked old, rusted metal, faded paint, its windows dark. But as it approached, its headlights flickered to life, bathing the platform in an eerie glow. The train came to a stop before them. The doors slid open with a groan. Inside, the carriage was dim, lined with empty seats. "No freaking way," Ethan breathed. Lisa took a hesitant step back. "Guys, I don't think we should..." But Ethan was already stepping inside. Brian exchanged a glance with Lisa before following. Reluctantly, Lisa stepped in last. The doors slid shut behind them. The train jolted forward. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. The air inside was cold. Too cold. Their breath came out in wisps of fog. Lisa hugged herself. "This doesn't feel right." Ethan ignored her, lifting his camera. "This is amazing. We're actually on it." Brian frowned. "But where is everyone?" They walked down the aisle, their footsteps echoing in the empty carriage. The seats were dusty, as if no one had sat in them for years. Then Lisa stopped. Her breath hitched. "Guys." Ethan turned. Lisa was staring at a seat near the back. It was occupied. A woman sat motionless, her face turned toward the window. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a long, tattered dress. Her hair fell in limp, tangled strands over her shoulders. Lisa swallowed hard. She wasn't there before. Brian took a cautious step forward. "Ma'am?" No response. Ethan hesitated before slowly raising his camera. The moment he looked through the viewfinder, the woman's head snapped toward him. Ethan yelped, stumbling backward. Her face, pale, sunken, eyes hollowed out voids of darkness. Her mouth parted, lips cracking as she whispered something too faint to hear. Lisa grabbed Brian's arm. "We have to get off this train." Ethan didn't argue. They turned, rushing toward the door. But when they reached it, the windows outside were black. No landscape, no stars, no world beyond, just endless, suffocating darkness. Lisa pounded on the door. "Open! Open!" The lights flickered. For a split second, the seats were full. Dozens of passengers, all pale, hollow-eyed, dressed in decayed clothing. Their heads turned in unison, watching, waiting. The lights flickered again, and the train was empty. A whisper drifted through the air, soft as a breath against their ears. "You shouldn't have boarded." The train sped up. The windows flickered, revealing flashes of a world they no longer recognized. Ethan turned to Lisa and Brian, only to find he was alone. The train rattled into the void, carrying another lost soul into the endless night. The train was nearly empty when Mark boarded, exhausted from a long day at work. He had taken this late-night route dozens of times before, but tonight, something felt different. The air inside the carriage was thick, almost stifling, and the dim fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically. There were only a few passengers scattered across the seats. An elderly woman sat hunched over near the front, staring down at her lap. A man in a worn-out suit sat by the window, motionless, his reflection blurred against the glass. And then there was the stranger. He sat a few rows away from Mark, directly across the aisle. He was dressed in an old-fashioned black coat, buttoned all the way up to his throat, his hands folded neatly on his lap. His face was pale, too pale, like someone who had never seen the sun. Mark tried not to stare, but something about the man unsettled him. The stranger didn't move. He didn't shift, didn't blink. He simply sat there, his gaze locked straight ahead. The train lurched forward. Mark pulled out his phone. No signal. Not unusual for this part of the route, but it made the silence in the carriage feel heavier. Minutes passed. The train rumbled on, rocking slightly with each turn. Mark stole another glance at the stranger. He was staring at him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He could have sworn the man had been looking straight ahead just a moment ago. Now his head was turned slightly in Mark's direction. His eyes were wide, unblinking, expressionless. A chill crept up Mark's spine. He quickly looked away, pretending to focus on his phone, though the screen was blank. The lights flickered. For a split second, the stranger was closer. Mark's pulse spiked. He hadn't heard him move, hadn't felt the shift in air. But now, the man was sitting in the row right in front of him. A whisper of cold air brushed against Mark's skin. "You look tired." Mark's body stiffened. He hadn't imagined that. The voice was real. Soft, raspy, almost a breath more than words. Slowly, Mark lifted his gaze. The stranger was still sitting there, still staring. His lips hadn't moved. Mark gripped the edge of his seat, his palms damp with sweat. The train entered a tunnel, and for a brief moment, everything plunged into darkness. Then, the lights returned, and the stranger was sitting right beside him. Mark recoiled, pressing himself against the window. His breath came in shallow gasps. The man was impossibly close now, his face inches away. His skin, paper-thin, almost translucent. His eyes, deep, empty pits. The train doors suddenly hissed open. Mark didn't wait. He bolted, stumbling out of the carriage onto the empty platform. The cold night air hit him like a wave, but he didn't stop moving. His legs carried him forward until he was several steps away from the train. Then, cautiously, he turned back. The train was still there, still waiting. But the carriage was empty. The man was gone. Mark's heart pounded against his ribs. His breaths came ragged and uneven, and then just before the doors slid shut, a whisper. "See you on the next ride." The train pulled away, disappearing into the darkness.